All right, good morning. Welcome to Adult Education. This is lesson number 2 of Owning Your Theology, our fall series for adult education this year, which Matt Skinner and I are co-leading. If you were not at the 8:30 service, you might not realize Matt is also our preacher for today. He picked up a sermon for Tim, who is out sick, and he's done a fantastic job with something he had about 24 hours to put together. So, Matt, grateful to you for sharing the word this morning, and we'll look forward to hearing what you say at 10:30. So, welcome. As we get started and find our seats, let's go ahead and open with a word of prayer. Almighty God, we put our trust in your gracious mercy. Help us today as we gather, as we learn, as we listen and speak and share. Grow us and grow our faith. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so as you guys know, our Owning Your Theology series is working through the baptismal questions that we have in the book of order. These are the questions that are used at baptisms for adults. In some churches, they're used for children. In some churches, they're used at confirmation. But these are the questions that are asked when somebody is baptized. And we're using them as sort of a deep dive into Reformed faith. So last week we passed out blue question cards. I see some of you brought them with you. Awesome. Did anybody not get one of those cards last week? Would you guys, CW, is that right? You'll find some blue cards right there. Would you grab one for yourself? And then if you don't have one, raise your hand. And if you guys don't mind just passing them to anybody who needs a blue question card. Anybody back there? Bonnie, do you have your hand up? Yeah, a couple back there. Thank you very much. But today we're going to be looking at question 1 in the series. And in fact, we're looking at the first part of question 1. So that question 1 is, trusting in the gracious mercy of God, do you turn from sin and renounce evil and its power in the world? And today we're really just starting with the first part of that question. And as we were divvying this up, I made this joke last time that Matt and I get to play good cop, bad cop here, right? Because I get to talk about the gracious mercy of God, and then for the next 2 weeks, you're going to get Matt Skinner on sin and then evil. So I thought he had drawn the short straw there. But then I started thinking about how to talk about God, and that is just such an enormous topic, right? God is beyond comprehension, inscrutable, invisible. I think of this in the hymn, immortal, invisible, God only wise, right? Such this enormous topic. How do we dive in? Well, because I went to law school and have some legal training, my impetus is to take a deep dive into the text, to look at the details of the wording, to analyze what's in front of us. So we're going to do that today with this first phrase of this first question, this trusting in the gracious mercy of God. So as a reminder, we're using the catechism as a launching point. We're not saying these are truths that everybody has to accept. We're not sort of force-feeding doctrine here. What we're doing is using this doctrine, this catechism, to kind of open up a place of exploration. So that's how we're going to get started today. And I want to just bring up, there's a quote from John Calvin that I want to frame our discussion with. He says, "Nearly all the wisdom we possess, that is to say, true and sound wisdom, consists of 2 parts: knowledge of God and of ourselves." Knowledge of God and of ourselves. So as we think about the kind of theology that we're doing today, as we look at this question, as we start to explore this question of who is God, right? These are the 2 parts. They're inseparable, the knowledge of God and of ourselves. And you can see it even built into this question. The gracious mercy of God is about who God is. And trusting has to do with who we are and what our role and our part is. I want to get us started with a little warm-up activity. And for this, I'm going to need to ask for a volunteer who is willing to write on the whiteboard. And because I'm not seeing any hands, I want to explain a little bit how I, as a leader, use volunteers. I will never ask you to come up and do something on the whiteboard that will put you on the spot, that will make you look foolish, that will require you to maybe know something that you don't know. Whenever I ask for a volunteer to write on the board, It's everybody else in the class who's on the spot. So I'll be asking you, the class, for the answer, and the volunteer's job is just to transcribe it on the board. So in some ways, that's, I see a hand back there, Martha, thank you very much. You realize that's the better gig. Come on up. And even though this is owning your theology, we're actually not going to start with theology today. We're going to start with grammar. So reach back into 3rd grade, right? Your initial classes on sentence construction, on grammar, on parts of speech. There are some of you here whose age suggests to me that you might have actually had to, at one point, diagram a sentence as a kid. Yes, okay, Rocky had to diagram a sentence. Anybody else? Yep, okay. So you guys probably are, some of you are from the vintage when this was really emphasized. Like, you probably also learned how to write cursive. Yes, okay, all right. So, Martha, what I'm going to ask you to do is underline the word trusting in that sentence. With a black marker, that'll make it a little more visible. Underline that word trusting. Okay, this is for you guys. What part of speech is that word? Verb. That's a verb. So just write underneath there, verb. And then under that verb, just in parentheses, write ending in ing. Okay, awesome. Okay, now if you wouldn't mind, underline that word gracious. Okay, guys, what part of speech is that word gracious? Adjective. Okay, we got a lot of people who had some very good grammar instruction. Adjective. Awesome. Okay, next we're on to mercy. What part of speech is mercy? Noun. Yep. Okay, and then underline the word God. And underneath that, just write divine name. Proper name, but we want, yes, in this case, we want a proper name that does refer to God. We're not talking about the gracious mercy of Mike. Divine, proper name, perfect. Okay, next, Martha, if you would take the eraser, keep the underline and the part of speech below it, but erase that word trusting. Yep, just keep the line, perfect. Same thing with, no, that's great. Same thing with gracious. Okay, great. Now let's lose mercy. Okay, and now let's lose that word God. Okay, let's step aside if you would. Okay, what do we have now? I almost heard it. We have a Mad Libs. That's correct. We have a game of Mad Libs. So this is not English class. This is the back seat of the car on a long road trip. So to be a little playful, to kind of get our theological muscles warmed up, we are actually going to play a game of Mad Libs here. And we are going to generate, as a crowd, some words to fill in for the verb, the adjective, the noun, the divine name. So we're looking for verbs ending in I. Oh, one more thing. If you wouldn't mind, just that preposition there, just put some parentheses in there, because we can play fast and loose with that parenthesis, okay? So you could, yeah, just so if you want to come up with a verb that doesn't take the preposition in, that's okay. We're gonna give ourselves a little license there. So what are some verbs that we could use for our relationship with God? Loving, believing, hoping. All right, I'm gonna slow us down for a second so that Martha can write. Loving, following, hoping, believing. Yep, what else? Living. What else? And they don't have to be your theology. They could be anybody's theology. Wondering. Arguing. I like that one. Waiting. Questioning. What else? How about shuddering? Fearing. Fearing? Yeah. Mocking? Yep. Listening? Yeah. Contemplating? Yep. Praying? Transforming. I know, seriously, I didn't expect to get this many options here. All right, now let's any other verbs before we move on? Doubting. Doubting, yep. Okay, let's move on to the adjective. What are some adjectives that we could use? Loving. I love how loving can show up as the verb for what we do or the adjective describing an attribute of God. Loving. What are some other adjectives? Boundless. Wondrous. Awesome. Timeless. What's that? Unending. Mysterious. Oh, unconditional. Yep. Forgiving. Forgiving. Capricious. I like that one. Who can spell capricious? We never put a volunteer on the spot. Who wants to spell capricious for us? C-A-P, I heard R-I-C-I-O-U-S. Okay, perfect. Awesome. Mysterious. I heard two from Matt's sermon this morning that I want to pull in. I heard majestic and inscrutable, which I thought were some good adjectives. Inscrutable. Yes, the SAT words here. Yep. The word inscrutable. So I heard Matt use the word this morning to describe a majestic and inscrutable God who notices us, right? A God who we can't fully put our heads around, or we can't fully grasp, and yet who knows us and our own lives. Matt, is that what you said this morning? Yeah, yeah. Well, I heard it, so the Spirit interceded in some way. Yeah. Um, something like obscure or a sort of hidden God, the God who shows up in the cloud in the desert, a God whose presence is palpable but who isn't fully seen, a sort of both present and hidden God at the same time. These are great. Let's move on to nouns. What are some nouns we could use to describe attributes of God? Savior, yep. Depth, yep. D-E-P-T-H, yeah, the death of God would be a different topic, although we may want to go there. What else? Love, yep. Love is everywhere. Yeah, that's right. Grace, yep. Sacrifice. Goodness. Wisdom. And that one I might say actually creation, because it's the creation of God. The divine name, we could put creator for divine name if we wanted to. Yeah. Anything else? Any other attributes? Yeah. Mystery. Mover. Yep. I might there say movement. Let's put mover in under proper name, and maybe also savior. We have wisdom up there. What about judgment? I haven't heard judgment, but that could go in that slot. It's a noun that describes one of the attributes of God. What else? What's that? Bread. Bread. Interesting. We had some this morning at the 8:30 service. Okay. What? Patience. Yes, patience of God. Anger. Yeah. Beauty. What was that? Majestic. I think we have majesty up there. Mystery we have, but not majesty. Okay, let's put majesty under the noun. Yeah, a lot of these could be the adjective or the noun. Um, okay, that last one, names for God. Creator. What else? Redeemer. Friend. Sustainer. All right. As you can see, there are options, right? There are so many words that we could use to describe the attributes of God, so many names. Martha, thank you very much. I appreciate the help. Um, so many different names for God, so many different ways of describing God, so many different ways of describing our relationship to God. Um, and 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 so when you see such a small list of words, trusting in the gracious mercy of God, that is by definition a selection, right? That is a deliberate choice to highlight these particular attributes of God, and also our response to God. And let's keep in mind at the bottom I wrote the rest of the question just because that's where we're headed, right? Heading towards a moment of confession, or a moment of turning away from sin and evil, or a moment of sort of renunciation of all of these sort of non-God things. What do we say about who God is, and how or who we are to be in response? So as we dive into this question of selection, I want to start actually by going a little bit further before looking at those words trusting and gracious and mercy, at other ways that the church has done this before, because this is not some sort of fixed eternal thing. The Presbyterian Church has always chosen these three words to talk about who God is in the baptismal questions or in any context. There's actually a ton of words that the church has used to describe God. So last time, when Matt was setting us up, he talked about the Reformed tradition being a confessional tradition, right? We have the Book of Confessions, and they're a source of all of these words for God and about God, and all they're not our gospel or our Bible. They're a subordinate authority, but they are in conversation with us as a Reformed church. So, CW, can I ask you to do a little more passing out? Again, there is a handout there. It's a white handout, 3 paragraphs on that first page. If you could get that passed out to folks in the room, Matt, maybe if you could help out, that would be great. And we're going to take a look. We're going to take a couple of minutes to read this through quietly, pull out or highlight any words that stick out to you. There's a couple pens on the table. Find the words for God in the confessions that stick out, either as places that we didn't emphasize in our moment right now in 2022, talking about who God is, or places that you find yourself having a strong emotional reaction to, whether for or against. So look through those 3. You'll see there's one from the Scots Confession, one from the Westminster Confession, and one from the Confession of 1967. So we'll give you guys a couple of minutes to do that. For those of you who are on the live stream, I've got those printed on the screen here. So what I'll do is just give you about a minute with each of those, if you're live streaming with us, to pick out words that you would like to use. So here we go. Just use the ones on the front of the page. You don't need to use the back of the page for now, just those three on the front. Kind of feel like I'm administering an exam and watching for when people put their pencils down. I hope it doesn't feel that way on your end. I hope this feels like an exercise in kind of exploration. Um, I am wondering, so as you read these historic confessions of the church, and again, these are just things that are excised from each of them. I kind of picked out the God paragraph from each of these three confessions. What did you notice in the language or the words used for God in these three parts of our book of confessions? First responses or reactions. Yes.
I'm fast forwarding to 1967.
Let's do it.
I really appreciate the world of space and time, which
Mm,
kind of reflects what we learned from Copernicus and Einstein about how the universe is actually constructed.
sure.
It's not like there's a place 2 miles above us that behaves differently than everything else.
Yep.
I think this picks that up.
Yeah, I love it. A sort of post-Copernican confession, a really different sense of what's out there in the world. Where even is God? That's a different question for the church in 1967 than it is for the church at the time of the Reformation. Yeah. Other things that you guys noticed. We don't have to start with Scots. We can start anywhere. Yes.
I noticed in the Scots the singularity of God.
Mm.
One and only one and only.
Yep. Alone. Yeah, that shows up again and again in the Scots Confession. They give a nod to yet in three distinct persons, but really this sense of God's unity being, and I don't think we put that down here. Actually, that wasn't one of our words. So you picked up something that is distinctive about this particular confession. Yeah. Other noticings. Yes, Elaine.
So I noticed in the Westminster Confession that there were a lot of things to describe God, and some of them seemed contradictory to me.
Okay, point them out. Where'd you see the contradictions?
And yet hates sin.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, no,
Yes.
and that's just a few. I thought there were many contradictions in that one.
Yeah. How does that theology fit together, right? Lifting up contradictory attributes of God. Sure. Yes. In the back. The most prescriptive. Okay. Oh, I'm remembering for our live stream crowd. Matt, would you mind moving the mic around? Yeah. So the comment was the most prescriptive. This one was the one that said God is this, right? Yeah. I think that's a good noticing there. Not just in terms of content, but in style. Yeah. Other thoughts? Yes.
Not being
There's
Presbyterian.
there's
What
the
are the numbers for in the Westminster
What are
Confession?
the numbers for? I was hoping that somebody would ask that question. Good noticing. What are the numbers for in the Westminster Confession? Does anybody know what those are? That's exactly right. Those are footnotes. They are verses. The Westminster Divines, the group that put together this confession, they gave it. It was actually commissioned by Parliament. We can get into in a minute. We'll get into the sort of rather bloody history of some of these confessions. But we're thinking the period of English history, right before the beheading of Charles I. Right. So this is a time of intense religious and political rivalry in England. The Parliament, the House of Commons, had commissioned this group to say, what is the faith of the church? Give us a theological statement. And so this is written prescriptively, right, in response to this question that is issued to this group of clergy. And they come back with the Westminster Confession, and Parliament sends it back to them and says, cite chapter and verse, right? Give us some footnotes here. We want to see where this comes from in the Bible. And I think, Matt, when we were having a conversation about this, you pointed out that the Westminster Confession actually starts with just a list of the books of the Bible. Is that right? Is this the one that begins
I
there?
think so. If it's not the very beginning, it's really close.
It's
so,
really...
like, where does your religious knowledge come from? The Westminster Confession is like the Bible is like the foundational place. They don't want to talk about human experience, for example.
No, that's right. It sets it up. The scriptures are our authority, and then the footnotes kind of backs that up. And this is, I believe, where the term proof texting comes from, which is if you're in a theological debate and you're proof texting, you're saying, oh, I got this from this chapter, this verse of the Bible, sort of bam, mic drop. That's kind of what these footnotes are about. But because we know that the Bible is a complex, big, contradictory book, I don't think that's news to anybody in this class, right? That the scriptures contain contradictions. You can produce a document like this, and you can proof text, as Elaine pointed out, really different attributes of God. You can find texts that support a God who is merciful and loving. You can find texts that that support a God who is terrible in his judgments. You could proof text the male pronoun for God if you wanted to from the scriptures. And even I think isn't there a line, I despise your sacrifices in the scriptures? I think God is even said to hate in the scriptures. So you can pull any of this out, and you see, I mean, this is what the church is doing in the confessions, right? Is selecting different attributes for God, and I think a great question is why? What is the church responding to at different points in its history in describing God in different ways? What else did you guys notice in looking at these? Yes, up front.
Sorry, I lost mine.
Oh, up here. And if you don't mind saying your name, even if we've already been introduced, just to help with me and the class getting to know each other. If everybody could start doing that, that'd be great.
I'm just picking up on the Westminster Confession. So I don't have a Presbyterian background.
That's okay.
I grew very impatient with that description. It just seemed to go on and on and on, starting to repeat words.
Yes, if we're being grammarians here, that's a run-on.
And then some of the characteristics have to have most on them. So, I just kind of was exhausted by the end of that.
Okay,
paragraph.
all right. This is not going to be your go-to confession for. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, CW.
Yeah, I think still picking on the Westminster Confession. I think it's a kind of weird irony there. There's like a tension I see, because there is certainly the pretense to be derived wholly from Scripture, and there is that, like, the living and true God strikes me as a very like Hebraic theism kind of thing to say. But then the most language and the immutability kind of harkens back to a more Hellenic substance ontology, and that to be perfect you cannot change.
Yeah. Yep. You're picking up on these really two different strands of theology: a sort of biblical Hebraic, a sort of living, changing, growing God, slams right into this Platonic, eternal, unchanging God. Absolutely. So those things are both there. Yes, over here at this table. And say your name if you would. Thank you.
Paul Floyd.
Paul, okay, great.
One of the things I noticed, each of the confessions is time-based. So we struggle with 1647 because the language from 1647 we don't really easily understand.
Sure.
I think that's why 1967 is easier, but even that bothers me, because God has created the world of space and time to be the sphere of his dealing with men. Post James Webb, I have a hard time imagining that all of that is created just to deal with me. So I struggle with that language.
Sure.
I think prior to Hubble, it was easy to see we had 9 planets, which we don't even have anymore. And it was easy to see the world as kind of like, this is it. And now it's like, this isn't it. So I think if we did one today, we would have different words. And so it's time-based. That's my point.
Sure, yeah, and that is by definition what these confessions are, right? Is they are moments in the church's life, and this is certainly, it remains an anthropocentric confession. Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
When I read these, I sort of read them for general tone, not for word specificity. And when I read the Scots Confession and the Westminster Confession, I pictured, people asking Moses to describe God when he walked behind him, because he had to hide his face or he would die. And that power and reverence, the distance, the awe, a coldness, a respect, a lot of those things. I see the Confession 1967, it starts with God's sovereign love. That was almost like a leper who was touched by Jesus when no one else would touch him.
Yeah.
How it starts with love instead of a cold distance.
Yeah, absolutely. And it even goes further with that, right? Like, I was looking through this confession for a paragraph that talked about God without talking about Jesus, that would just sort of start with God, capital G, and this one, as soon as it starts talking about God's sovereign love, it gets right into Jesus Christ and reveals God's love in Jesus Christ by showing power in the form of a servant, wisdom in the folly of the cross, goodness in receiving sinful men. So there is that move immediately into a kind of power that gives up power, a kind of divine presence that is incarnate, intimate, knowable through Christ. So I think you're absolutely right. It's a different view of God. And I like that image actually that you shared of this sort of Moses, can't even see God's face, sort of cowering behind God, shows up, glowing with holiness coming down the mountain from talking to God. Really different image of who God is. And I wonder if that's connected to God's sort of physical distance now with the James Webb, the enormity of the universe. Less kind of access there. Yeah, Rocky, go ahead. Oh, sorry, Ken's got the mic. Sorry, Ken, go next.
Yeah, I have the mic.
It's a little Lord of the Flies here. Who's got the conch?
In the Confession of 1967, I picked out the word but.
Okay.
And I did because, I was trained that if you're reading something and you come across the but, you're supposed to ignore everything that occurred before it.
Okay.
People are dismissive of what they said before. And so human thought ascribes to God superlatives of power, wisdom, and goodness.
Yeah.
But, and to me, maybe that's an important but, because we shouldn't just live in our thoughts. We should live in the world.
Yeah.
And it goes on to say, how Christ showed his love. So let's pay attention to what someone does as opposed to what they say.
Yeah.
And to me, that's a living faith. It's a expression, however you define the unknowable or the undescribable.
Sure.
We all can kind of recognize an act of kindness and an act of love.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like that propels us forward into the next two questions, actually, for later on. And it also, going back to the first part of what you said, that word but and the dismissive of what came before, human thought ascribes to God superlatives of power, wisdom, and goodness. Where did we just see superlatives of power, wisdom, and goodness, right? In the Westminster Confession, in the Scots Confession, those are there before. So, yeah, I appreciate that, because both of those things, I think, both reflect back on the prior confessions and anticipate forward where we're going in the class. Yeah, I think Rocky had his hand up over here. Ken made Rocky's point. Oh, perfect. All right. Anybody want to make another point, their own or someone else's? Yes, over here.
Thank you. And Lewis, and following on his point here, about the time sensitivity of it and being aware of that, not only in what's developed socially and scientifically, but when we read about the 60s and the 70s, it's about relationships, and there's a movement and there's a total change socially that is happening, at least in the United States. And I assume this had U.S. roots in it.
Yes, we can talk about this
but
in a second.
taking those things that are happening socially into account, as well as the scientific changes and the reflection in the kinds of words that get used, I think is helpful to understanding these kinds of things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The sort of social changes that are happening in the world. I mean, one thing that nobody said yet, but I'm sure it's on our minds, is like, even still in 1967, we're using the word men to talk about humanity here, right? Like, so even this confession that feels more modern, more present to us, uses language that we wouldn't use today if as a church crafting a similar confession in this moment. So these do, even that one feels really particular and time bound. Yes, Brian.
Brian Eklund. Something that kind of struck me as I was looking at the Scots Confession in comparison to the Confession of 1967, despite the fact that there's 400 years between them, is that the Scots Confession was right in the middle of the European Reformation. Reformation thought had a lot of dogmatics because they were coming from a place where I think that the Roman Catholic Church at the time was more or less telling you what to think, how to think, and what it took to achieve salvation.
Sure.
And so the Reformation was kind of a step back. They had to reevaluate what they believed. And so you see a lot of we confess, and then a list of all these things. I think the language also is, there's a lot of singularity, to whom alone we must cleave. And then when you compare that to Confession of 1967, it's the mystery. We've acknowledged the Reformation. Everything is evolving. Theology and how we think about God is an evolutionary movement. And that, I thought that was really quite telling when I was kind of comparing them. So.
Yeah, I mean, the Scots Confession really is about putting a stake in the ground and saying, here's what we believe and why we have the authority to believe this. I mean, that confession in particular came out of a period in the life of Scotland where There was this sort of alliance between Scottish nobles and Mary, Queen of France, who was a Catholic. And then there was a group of Scottish clergymen who were rebelling against that. Some were burned at the stake. This is sort of life and death theology that we're talking about here. I think we need to be a little bit cautious about saying that it was only the Roman Catholic Church that was doctrinaire about things. We know that John Calvin has a grim history himself. So these were tactics used on both sides. But it was certainly a time when when theology. Theology still matters, right? But this sort of what is your theological commitment could cost you your life. And so that's written in response to this. And in fact, it was written by this Scots Confession was written by 6 men whose first name was all John. There's only one whose last name I remember, John Knox, but that should be a familiar name. Was one of the authors, and he tells the story that they wrote the whole confession in 4 days. The revolution had the fighting had ended in a peace treaty. A Scottish Parliament had been formed, and the Scottish Parliament commissioned a confession or a statement of faith, and this Scots Confession was the one written in response to that. So again, that language of God alone, right? There's a hidden implication, and not the Pope, and not the Church. There's even some more. Explicit anti-Catholic language. I forget if it's in the Scots Confession or some of these. And when you get ordained, they always ask you if you have any. I think it's called scruples, things in the confession that you don't agree with. And a lot of people have in the past used their scruples they will use it as a verb. You scruple something from the Westminster Confession, for example, condemning homosexuality. I have a colleague who scrupled specifically the parts of the confessions that were explicitly anti-Catholic or explicitly anti-Anabaptist. She said, I don't subscribe to any of these. And I'm sure that pretty much everybody else ordained in this time also doesn't subscribe to those, but I appreciated her willingness to name where she diverged explicitly from some of what the confessions say. So any other thoughts on the text of these? I've given a little bit of context already. I know we have a lot of people who in the room who were not raised Presbyterian for whom these confessions may be somewhat unfamiliar. So I don't want to repeat things that people already know, but I do want to give a little bit of context just to say, what are we even looking at, right, when we see these things? So I've talked a little bit about the Scots Confession, where it came from with respect to some of the political and religious fighting happening in Scotland in the 1550s, 1560s. Fast forward about 100 years, and you get to the Westminster Confession, which is a very different sort of set of circumstances. In England, the Reformation begins right in the middle of the 16th century. Henry VIII needs another wife. That's the occasion for Reformation in England. Very different from Martin Luther having these brilliant theological insights supposedly while in the bathroom in the monastery where he was in Germany, right? Martin Luther's having these amazing thoughts about grace and faith alone and salvation. And in England, the story is really different. It's this political power. It's this marriage. So in some ways, the English church kind of has to play catch up. In the German church, the sort of theological reformation happens first, and then the political divisions are around, is your prince Protestant or Catholic? That determines the religions of the various, I don't know what the political divisions are called, the sort of states or principalities within Germany. In England, there's a sort of top-down, we are now Church of England, not entirely sure what that means politically or theologically, but the bishops are appointed by the king. We're all going to use the Book of Common Prayer. There's going to be this new translation of the Bible, the King James translation. But there was a lot of on-the-ground theological disagreement and questions, and one strand of that was this sort of Puritan tradition, which stemmed into a kind of Presbyterian polity and thought that had a very Calvinist theology, a more Presbyterian kind of representative vision of polity. And that was getting worked out at first non-violently and then violently. And the date of the Westminster Confession kind of coincides with the period about 100 years after the English Reformation began, when everything came to a head. So that's what we're looking at in Westminster. Why, again, we have those footnotes, right? That insistence on who has authority to speak. This comes from the Bible. That's what we're seeing there. And then the Confession of 1967, there just hadn't been another confession written for that. I think, I'm pretty sure, I have to check my book of order, but I'm pretty sure that in our book of order, yeah, we go straight from Westminster. Oh no, there's the Declaration of Barmin, which historically predates the Confession of 1967, but didn't become, I think, a confession of the church before then. But for a long time, the church is not writing these confessions anymore. And so in 1967, there's this realization, gosh, the world has changed. The mission of the church has changed. And we actually want to write a confession that says something not just about theology, that is about theology, in that it's not just about who is God, but who are we called to be as the church, the knowledge of God and of ourselves. There's this real emphasis on what the church is in response to God's reconciling love, and what the world's mission is, what the church's mission is in a world that is dealing with racism, with changing relations, with changing sexual practices and relationships, with nationalism and violence, the war in Vietnam, all of these issues that the church was addressing. And that piece is new. So if we read other parts of this confession, we would see more of that than in what came before. And the other thing that happened in 1967 with this confession is that this is when the church said, hey, we want a book of confessions. Because Westminster had been the gold standard for a long time. Westminster was sort of the be-all and end-all of Reformed theology. And with this new confession of 1967, also came the impetus to compile not just Westminster and the Confession of 1967, but some of the other earlier confessions that have a different emphasis. So there's actually other documents that we didn't have time to read and discuss and talk about today, but that also said something about the church's beliefs and practices, and they made it together into this book of confessions that we have now. So there was not just a statement of where the church is today, but in some ways a compilation of the places the church has been, and this move away from seeing the Westminster Catechism or Confession as the eternal truth of Reformed theology, which is, I think, the status that it had held. I don't know if there are people in the room who have memories of that time when if there's any old school Presbyterians here. No, yes, okay. Do you remember Westminster being the kind of, okay. Did you use the catechism version of it in your religious instruction, or, okay. Yeah, so I'm hearing that, yes, we've got a memory of the time when Westminster was it, and you used that in your religious instruction. I know churches that divide up the Westminster Catechism, still, these are more PCA churches now, but that divide up that Westminster Catechism, and every week in worship you say a question and answer within the context of the service. Yes. Is there a mic over here?
Betty Pasick. So the word reformed is used a lot in discussing the history of Presbyterianism.
Right.
So will you just give us the definition, the
Sure.
official definition?
That is a great question. How are we using the word reformed here? Because there can be a little creep between the word Reformation, which applies to the whole shebang, right? Luther is like the kickoff of the Reformation in a lot of ways. But there's Luther, there's Anabaptists, there's what we call the Reformed tradition, which is a narrower segment of the Reformation. So when I'm using that word reformed, I'm talking about a particular sort of family of churches and a sort of area of theology that came out of the Reformation to distinguish it from Lutheran, Anabaptist, a couple other sort of theological designations. But it's more than just Presbyterians alone. We have cousins. I don't see them here today, but Pat and Terry grew up in the I believe it was the RCA church, the Reformed Church. There's the Dutch Reformed Church. There's a lot of different strands of it now. So I'm using that to be a little bit more expansive than Presbyterian alone, but not so expansive as to cover all of Protestantism. Does that make sense? in belief. So that's a great. What's the difference in belief theologically? So there is a lot of overlap here, but the couple things really kind of characterize the Reformed tradition, and others pipe up here to help me out on this one. But I would say the sovereignty of God, right? God being in control. God is God's power, God's might. It is up to God that we are saved. It is not something that we do of our own efforts, right? So sovereignty of God is a major emphasis of the Reformed tradition, Reformed theology. What else? An emphasis on scriptural authority, right? Scriptures being the unique and authoritative source of our knowledge of God. You see that showing up in all the footnotes in the Westminster Confession, for example. So scriptural authority, not necessarily scriptural inerrancy. We talked about this last time. Most Reformed Christians aren't going to sort of die on the hill of scriptural inerrancy, but they are going to place a high view on scriptural authority. This Bible is a special book that tells us something particular. It often goes along with a certain kind of polity, a certain kind of church organization. It's called Presbyterian polity, and Presbyterian here meaning elders. It's the church is governed by elders. It's not up to, Tim doesn't have the be all and end all as the pastor of the church about what happens here. Pastors and elders share that authority of governance. 2 sacraments. I believe, well, you Lutherans can tell me, how many sacraments are there in the Lutheran Church? There's 2 in the Lutheran Church. Okay, there's not 7. So Lutherans, so Catholics have 7, Lutherans have 2, Presbyterians have 2. The Lutheran Mass, the worship style is also different. I think a Lutheran Mass does resemble a Catholic Mass more so. More so, yeah, not quite, yeah. But for example, most Lutherans that I know would read an Old Testament, an epistle, a gospel, and sing a psalm. You know, some things that resemble Lutheran polity. There are bishops in Lutheran polity. There aren't bishops in Reformed polity. What else? Anything I'm missing here? Yes.
Two things. There is a debate between Luther and the Calvinists over the presence of Christ in the Eucharist.
Yep.
Luther had, sorry.
Repeat that first part.
Yeah, there was a debate between Luther and the Calvinists over the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Luther, and if you go to conservative Lutheran churches, you have to affirm that Christ is bodily present in the sacrament. The Calvinists had a little different view of that.
Sure, yeah.
And then there's also the so-called third use of the law.
Yes.
That Luther was, the law makes you feel guilty and restrains you from doing evil, but it doesn't tell you how to be good.
Yeah.
And the Calvinists said, yeah, it helps be good too. So
excellent. Those are 2 great points. So what's happening in communion? There's some difference there, and is the law helpful, redemptive in some way? And Calvin, trained as a lawyer, said, yeah, actually, there's that third use of the law. It helps us to organize and form our society and the way that we live together. So those are absolutely great points. And we had Rocky back here. Yes, reformed, always reforming.
Always reforming.
Always reforming. So it's not like at one moment in our history we decided fixed in certain way that everything was gonna be, right, and just moved on from there. No, there's that notion of always reforming, this openness to the Spirit working through the church, and that's why we have a book of confessions and not just one, right? We remembered that Westminster was not the moment when the church got it right, that we're still open to hearing God's voice and to studying the scriptures, to going together towards scripture as an authority and asking, what do we hear for this moment? Yeah, of course. All right, so I have taken us, I had so many other activities for us to do, but you guys lingered so well over these 3 first confessions. I would love for you to take home the last one, the brief statement of faith. Give that a read. That was at a time when 2 Presbyterian denominations that had split in the 19th century over slavery came together in 1983, produced a new confession. This is a portion of that. Read through that. pick up elements of trust, of grace, of mercy in that. And then the last, I was going to have you do this as a group, but for another thing you guys can do for homework is if you were to fill out the Mad Libs on your own for where you are at this particular moment in your life, what verb would you use? What adjective, what noun, and what name for God? How would you begin that sentence? So that's what I'd like you to take away from this and give some thought to in the coming week. Matt, I know you are about to run out of the room, but do you have anything that you'd like the class to be thinking about for next week? For sin and evil, or no?
Just sin and evil.
Just sin and evil. So in addition to thinking about trusting in the gracious mercy of God, look ahead and think about sin and evil. I have no idea what Matt has in store for you, but I'm sure it's something very, very devious. So thank you for being here today. I've really enjoyed this. See you next week.